Fame made them immortal, but death made them human. These stars were legends in life, icons etched into our memories. Yet at the end, they were laid bare for the world to see. One final curtain call and an open casket. These are the 15 celebrities you didn't know had open casket funerals, and why you'd barely recognize them today. 1. Elvis Presley. It was the summer of 1977. Memphis shimmered under a curtain of grief. Outside Graceland's ornate gates, mourners lined up by the tens of thousands. Some clutched photos, others guitars, and many just stood there in silence, too stunned to speak. Inside, shielded behind velvet ropes and security, the king lay still. Elvis Aaron Presley, the man who ignited a cultural revolution, was placed in a copper-plated casket lined with pale blue velvet. He wore a white suit with a blue shirt, his Vegas-era stage look. His trademark pompadour was carefully styled one last time, but fans who viewed him closely whispered the same thing. He didn't look like Elvis. His face, bloated from years of prescription drugs and health decline, was pale and waxen. The man who once danced with fire now lay still, surrounded by a sea of roses. Over 30,000 fans passed by his open casket that day. Some fainted, others left lipstick kisses on the side of the glass, and a few, unable to accept reality, swore he was just asleep. The grief became hysteria when a man named Albert Goldman would later claim that the body in the casket wasn't Elvis at all, but a wax dummy. That conspiracy only deepened the myth. But one thing was undeniable. The world said goodbye to its king through an image so vulnerable it pierced the fantasy. His final encore wasn't a stage performance. It was the moment millions stared into a coffin and realized that even gods fall. 2. Marilyn Monroe. The year was 1962, and Hollywood had gone quiet. Not even the paparazzi dared chase shadows after the news broke. Marilyn Monroe was dead. She was found alone, face down in bed, a bottle of pills beside her, a phone dangling from her hand. But the mystery of her death would pale compared to the haunting final image of her body. Joe DiMaggio, her former husband, planned the funeral himself. It was private, elegant, and fiercely guarded. Just 30 mourners were allowed into the small chapel at Westwood Village Memorial Park. Among them, Monroe's makeup artist, Alan Whitey Snyder, who had been asked years earlier by Marilyn to make her beautiful if anything ever happened. And he did. Her body lay in a closed casket for the press, but for her inner circle, Marilyn was seen one last time. She wore a green Emilio Pucci dress, chosen for its softness against her skin. Her platinum hair was carefully waved, her lips painted coral pink, not the usual red. She looked delicate, yes, but something had changed. The vivacity that once danced across her face was gone. Her skin was too smooth, too still. Some said she looked like a wax figure. Others whispered she was more beautiful in death than life, but almost all agreed. She was unrecognizable. White roses adorned the casket, and DiMaggio refused to allow any Hollywood elites to attend, not Sinatra, not the Kennedys. He would send fresh flowers to her grave 3 times a week for the next 20 years. The open casket wasn't seen by the public, but those few who did walk up to her said the image haunted them forever. Marilyn, the dream girl of a generation, had become a ghost of herself, quiet, cold, and unreachable. 3. James Brown. December 30th, 2006. A red carpet was rolled out inside the Apollo Theater in Harlem, not for a show, but for a farewell. James Brown, the godfather of soul, was returning to the venue that made him a star, but this time he was the stillest man in the room. His body was placed in a gleaming 24-karat gold Promethean casket. It shimmered under the theater lights like a stage prop, but there was nothing theatrical about the sorrow. Dressed in a black suit with red accents and matching gloves, Brown looked like he could rise and shout, "I feel good," at any second. His hair was styled perfectly, his signature cape draped across his shoulder, his final costume. The casket was open and fans streamed past in silence. Over 8,500 people filed into the Apollo to see him one last time. Some broke down in tears. Others danced outside, holding radios blaring, "Papa's got a brand new bag," and "It's a man's world." It felt like a concert and a crucifixion all at once. But what struck many was how small he seemed. Without the fire of his performance, without the scream, without the motion, James Brown looked like a man who had poured every drop of life into the microphone. His face, once animated with emotion, now sat frozen, calm, almost regal, like a general going to war in his best armor. His funeral tour continued in Augusta, Georgia, and eventually into private burial. But that open casket moment at the Apollo, that was James Brown's final encore, a haunting, beautiful goodbye to a man who never stopped performing, not even in death. 4. John F. Kennedy. November 22, 1963. Dallas. The world changed in a single gunshot. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in broad daylight. His life and idealism violently ended in the backseat of a motorcade. America froze in grief. A generation of innocence was shattered, and what came next would be the most intimate and controversial funeral in presidential history. After the fatal shooting, Kennedy's body was flown back to Washington. At Bethesda Naval Hospital, his wounds were cleaned, and his face was carefully reconstructed. A closed casket was immediately planned for the public. The damage to his head, horrific and irreversible, left no option, but privately, it was different. In the East Room of the White House, under the glinting chandeliers and veils of silence, Jacqueline Kennedy insisted on seeing him one last time. Only a few close family members and aides were allowed to enter, and there, behind guarded doors, was President Kennedy in an open casket. His face had been cosmetically repaired to the best of the mortician's ability. His body wore his navy blue suit, but those who saw him said the vibrance was gone. His complexion was lifeless, his head tilted slightly, a faint shadow revealing the trauma hidden by mortuary makeup. Jackie stood beside him for hours, still wearing the blood-stained pink Chanel suit from Dallas. She would not change. She would not cry publicly. She just stared at him, her husband, the father of her children, the leader of the free world, reduced to stillness. The casket was later sealed before the public viewing at the Capitol Rotunda. Millions watched on television as the flag-draped coffin passed by. But few know there was a moment when history stood still and looked death in the eye. The open casket wasn't about spectacle, it was about truth, that even the most powerful man in the world could be broken, and that behind all the pageantry there was a wife, a family, and a nation lost in mourning. 5. Aretha Franklin, August 28, 2018. Detroit. The city of soul was about to say goodbye to its queen. Aretha Franklin, the voice that shook churches and stadiums alike, was gone at 76. But true to her grandeur, her send-off would be more than a funeral. It would be a 4-day celebration of life, music, and memory. With one haunting centerpiece, her open casket, placed in the rotunda of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, her body was displayed for 2 full days, not once but twice, because Aretha didn't just have one outfit for her final appearance, she had 4. On the first day, she lay in a golden casket lined with rose-colored velvet, wearing a bright crimson dress with matching Christian Louboutin stilettos. Her legs were crossed at the ankles, a royal pose. Her hair was perfectly curled, her lips painted with care. The symbolism was everywhere. Red for strength, red for fire, red for power. On the second day, the dress changed. Now she wore a powder blue outfit with silver heels. By the third, a glamorous gold gown. And finally, at her funeral service at Greater Grace Temple, she was dressed in a sparkling champagne gown with coordinating pumps. Each look chosen not as costume, but as legacy. Because Aretha was never just a singer, she was a symbol. Fans, over 30,000 of them, lined up for hours, some all night, just to walk past her casket. Some wept uncontrollably. Others sang. Some just stared in silence, but almost all said the same thing. She looked majestic. Different, yes, but regal, otherworldly, unreachable. That open casket wasn't a goodbye. It was a final encore, Aretha's last stage, where she demanded dignity, celebration, and style, and even in stillness, she commanded the room. 6. Emmett Till, August 1955, Mississippi. The body of a 14-year-old boy was pulled from the Tallahatchie River, beaten, bloated, mutilated beyond recognition. His name was Emmett Till, and what happened next changed American history. Emmett had traveled from Chicago to Mississippi to visit relatives. Accused, falsely, of whistling at a white woman, he was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by 2 white men. When his body was returned to his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, it came in a sealed box. Authorities begged her not to open it, but she insisted, and not only did she open it, she made the world look. At Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ, Emmett's body was displayed in an open casket for 5 days. What people saw was unimaginable. His face was unrecognizable. One eye was gouged out, his nose broken, his tongue severed, a bullet hole through his head, barbed wire wrapped around his neck, and yet his mother stood there beside him. Calm, resolved. She said, "I want the world to see what they did to my baby." Over 50,000 people came to view his body. Magazines published the photos. And America, comfortable in its silence, was forced to confront its horror. That open casket wasn't just a funeral, it was a revolution. It ignited the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks would say she thought of Emmett when she refused to give up her seat that December. Martin Luther King Jr. would reference his murder in speeches. But above all, it reminded the world that death doesn't end the story, it begins a reckoning. Till didn't look like a boy in that casket. He looked like a warning, a prophecy, a mirror. And Mamie Till's act of courage turned grief into a movement. 7. Bob Marley, May 21, 1981. The scent of ganja mingled with funeral flowers. The sounds of hymns collided with reggae rhythms. And inside Kingston's National Arena, the man who gave voice to resistance and spiritual revolution lay in an open casket. Bob Marley was gone, but even in death, he refused to be silenced. Marley's funeral was a state affair attended by politicians, fellow musicians, dignitaries, and tens of thousands of ordinary Jamaicans. Yet the scene inside the arena was unlike any traditional service. At the center stood a wooden casket, open, revealing the body of the man who had become a prophet in his time. His dreadlocks were neatly arranged, his face composed in peaceful stillness. But it was the details that made the moment sacred. Marley wore a crimson, gold, and green Ethiopian robe, the colors of the Rastafarian faith he championed. In his hand rested a branch of ganja. By his side, his beloved red Gibson Les Paul guitar, his Bible, and a soccer ball. It wasn't just a body, it was a shrine to a life fully lived. His personal totems were tokens of war and peace, rhythm and roots. They were Marley's soul laid bare. But even with the casket open, many mourners couldn't believe it. This was the man who'd sung about freedom, who stood up to bullets, who toured through cancer. Now still, quiet, fragile. Some said he looked too clean, too formal. He always had a fire, one fan whispered. But in there, the fire was gone. And yet, that stillness, so alien for a man of Marley's spirit, became its own anthem. Outside, people wept. Others danced. Some sang Redemption Song in trembling voices. His funeral procession stretched for miles, winding through Kingston like a final rebellion against silence. The open casket wasn't about vanity, it was testimony. A man who had spoken for millions was now at rest, but his eyes, closed though they were, still carried the echoes of revolution. 8th, Selena Quintanilla-Perez, April 3, 1995. Corpus Christi. The city trembled with grief. Fans wrapped around the Bayfront Plaza Convention Center. Teens clutched photos, parents held candles. Inside, beneath solemn lights, the Queen of Tejano music lay in her casket. Selena was only 23, and yet her death felt like the loss of an era. 3 days earlier, she had been shot by someone she once trusted. The betrayal made the wound deeper. Now, over 50,000 fans gathered to say goodbye. And there, behind a glass-topped casket, they saw her one last time. Selena's face, so full of light and laughter on stage, was now cold. She wore a sparkling purple gown, much like the ones she dazzled in during her concerts. Her signature dark hair was curled gently, framing her face with care, but it was her expression, neutral, fixed, unnervingly quiet, that shattered people. Fans streamed past the casket, some too overwhelmed to look. Others pressed their palms against the glass, mouthing, "I love you." Some placed roses. A few fainted. It wasn't just that she had died, it was how young she was, how vibrant she had been, and how brutally fast she had been taken. At one point, her family considered closing the casket. Rumors spread that she didn't look like herself, but they left it open because Selena had always been close to her fans. She wasn't just a singer, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend to millions, and her farewell had to feel personal. Inside the chapel, silence reigned. Outside, her songs blasted from car stereos. The contrast was surreal. Inside, stillness. Outside, life. But that's what Selena was to so many, a bridge between worlds. Her open casket funeral was televised across Latin America. It sparked tributes, murals, vigils. But for those who saw her in person, the image of Selena, lying still in sequins, remains frozen in memory. A star extinguished, but still dazzling in death. 9. Whitney Houston, February 18, 2012. New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. The place where Whitney Houston first sang as a child now became the sanctuary where her voice was laid to rest. The service was private, exclusive to family and friends, but in that quiet chapel, behind closed doors, her casket lay open, Whitney's final performance, seen only by those who had truly known her. She had been found just days earlier, in a Beverly Hills hotel bathtub, gone at 48. The voice that had once soared through octaves and broken records was silenced, but for a brief moment she was shown to the world again, not as a superstar but as a daughter of Newark. Whitney wore a regal purple gown encrusted with crystals. Her makeup was flawless, soft blush, shimmering eyeshadow, a soft pink on her lips. Her hair was curled elegantly, and she held a small gold Bible in her hand. At her feet, white lilies and roses. The private viewing was arranged with dignity. Dionne Warwick and Clive Davis wept. Oprah stood silently. Cissy Houston, her mother, had one request. Let her look like an angel. But even with the divine styling, those who saw her were shaken. The sparkle was there, but so was the cost. Years of addiction, tabloid scrutiny, personal heartbreak, it had all carved itself into her. Some said she looked peaceful, others said she looked exhausted. The photos never leaked publicly, but descriptions did, and they painted a picture of a woman who had given the world her voice and lost herself in the process. The open casket wasn't meant for spectacle, it was a private goodbye, a glimpse into the quiet aftermath of a life lived too loudly. For those who loved her, it was closure. For those who remembered her only through microphones and music videos, it was a reminder. Whitney was human, vulnerable, breakable. She was buried beside her father, her voice, her glory, her tragedy, entombed in silence. But for that fleeting, fragile moment, Whitney Houston wasn't a headline. She was simply a woman at rest. 10th Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1968. Memphis, Tennessee. A single shot echoed across a motel balcony, and with it the hope of a generation seemed to shatter. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the moral voice of the civil rights movement, was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel. But his final farewell, just days later in Atlanta, would leave behind an image as searing as any speech he had ever given. At Ebenezer Baptist Church, where King once preached thunderously about justice and peace, his body lay in an open casket, dressed in a plain black suit, his hands gently folded, a single white carnation pinned to his chest. His mustache was trimmed, his face serene, but the scar on his jaw, where the bullet had entered, was faintly visible. Makeup covered much, but not all. The wound was still there, a quiet reminder that the dream had been paid for in blood. Over 50,000 mourners passed by his casket during 2 services. Some collapsed in sobs, others reached out to touch the glass. Mothers held their children up, whispering, "Look, this is the man who tried to change the world." But what truly stunned people wasn't the damage, it was the stillness. King had been a man of thunder, of marches, megaphones, and jail cells, of sermons that shook walls and spirits alike. But now he was silent, and somehow that silence screamed louder than anything he'd ever said. Outside, the streets overflowed with mourners. Mahalia Jackson sang, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," King's favorite hymn. His casket was carried through Atlanta on a simple wooden cart pulled by mules, just as he had requested. No grandeur, no crowns, just humility and pain. That open casket moment, captured by photographers, remains one of the most haunting images of the 20th century. Not because he looked broken, but because he looked finished. A man who had poured every ounce of himself into a dream, and now lay asleep inside it. 11. Hank Williams, January 1st, 1953. Montgomery, Alabama. The South had lost its voice. Hank Williams, the lonesome cowboy poet who spun sorrow into song, was dead at 29. His heart had simply stopped during a long, lonely car ride, and when his body was brought home, the line between myth and man began to blur. Inside the Montgomery Auditorium, over 20,000 mourners gathered. The scene looked more like a country concert than a funeral. Fans came in from across the South, some barefoot, others in their Sunday best. They came not just for the music, but to see him. To see Hank. His casket was open, lined with silver satin. He wore a light gray suit, white shirt, and a black tie. His famous cowboy hat sat nearby. His hands, once strumming Heartbreak into steel strings, now rested motionless on his chest. But something about the face unnerved people. It was too calm, too waxy. The fire of his voice, the ache, had vanished. The lines to view him wrapped around city blocks. Some said he looked angelic. Others said he looked like a statue. But all agreed. The man who had bared his soul in every lyric now looked like a stranger. Behind the scenes, whispers swirled. That the body had to be heavily embalmed to hide damage. That he had died in a haze of morphine and alcohol. That his demons had finally outrun him. But inside that room, all of that faded. What remained was silence, reverence, and the realization that Hank's voice, raw, broken, true, was gone. As his casket was lowered into the earth, a fan reportedly tossed in a harmonica, another a bottle of whiskey, and from somewhere in the crowd, someone sang, "I'm so lonesome I could cry." It wasn't just a lyric, it was the soundtrack of that day. 12th. Grace Kelly, September 18th, 1982. Monaco. The tiny principality came to a standstill. The American actress who had become royalty, Grace Kelly, Princess of Monaco, was gone. A car crash on the winding roads above Monte Carlo had claimed her life. She was 52, and when the cathedral doors opened for her funeral, the world gasped, because even in death, she radiated elegance. Inside St. Nicholas Cathedral, her casket sat near the altar, White roses and lilies draped the pews. Mourners from across the globe filled the space. Royalty, diplomats, old Hollywood friends. Cary Grant wept openly. Princess Diana sat quietly near the front, barely 21, visibly shaken. It wasn't just a funeral. It was a haunting intersection of glamour and tragedy. The casket was open for a brief period prior to the main service during a private family visitation. A handful of individuals, including her children and husband Prince Rainier III, were permitted to say their final goodbyes. Grace's body, placed in a pale ivory dress with lace detailing, lay beneath a soft veil. Her hands held a rosary. Her face, though softened by time, still bore that unmistakable bone structure. But the vibrancy, the glowing presence she had once brought to the silver screen, was gone. She looked fragile, more porcelain than human. Her daughter Caroline reportedly whispered, "She looks like she's sleeping." The casket was later closed before the full state funeral, and when the service ended, the palace released no official photos, no film, only memory. Yet those who saw her said it felt surreal. Grace Kelly had been Hollywood royalty before she ever wore a crown, and now she was gone, not in a blaze of cinema or a royal decree, but in stillness, in veiled beauty, in silence. That image of Grace resting beneath cathedral light remained etched in the hearts of those few who witnessed it. A star had fallen, a princess had passed, and even in death she carried herself with grace. 13. Marvin Gaye, April 5, 1984. Los Angeles. The pews of the Forest Lawn Memorial Park were filled with silent sobs and stunned faces. Marvin Gaye, the voice of seduction, soul, and sorrow, was gone. Shot dead by his own father just one day before his 45th birthday. It wasn't just a loss, it was a tragedy soaked in confusion, grief, and silence. At the Open-Casket wake held days earlier, the man who once made crowds swoon with "Let's get it on" and cry with "What's going on" lay in still repose. He wore a simple black suit with a white shirt. His beard was perfectly trimmed. A rosary was wrapped around his fingers, but even as fans and loved ones filed in, more than 10,000 by some estimates, many couldn't bring themselves to look. Marvin had been found face down in his bedroom, gunned down in an argument that had spiraled into finality. His body bore 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest, another to the shoulder. Embalmers worked carefully to restore the image of the legend, to present him as he once was, peaceful, warm, smooth, but those who knew him best said it didn't quite work. He looked tired, one Motown executive whispered, like he finally gave in. The viewing was intimate but public. Stevie Wonder wept openly. Smokey Robinson clutched Marvin's hand and whispered a prayer. Diana Ross arrived draped in black lace, sunglasses hiding her tears. Outside, fans lit candles and sang his greatest hits, turning the sidewalk into a spontaneous gospel revival. But inside, there was only that haunting stillness. Marvin Gaye, the man whose voice had lifted generations, was no longer singing, no longer speaking, no longer fighting. The Open-Casket revealed what most of the world never saw, how fame, genius, and personal demons had all collided into a kind of beautiful collapse. And when the casket finally closed, it wasn't just the end of a singer, it was the end of a voice that had once held America accountable and had died whispering for love. 14. Mother Teresa. September 13th, 1997. Calcutta, India. The heat was thick, the air almost unmoving, yet the streets outside Netaji Indoor Stadium were dense with mourners, nuns in crisp white saris, presidents, poets, lepers, street children, and somewhere among them a woman who had touched millions, now lay still in an open casket. Mother Teresa had died 6 days earlier, but the world still hadn't let go. She had lived without riches, without luxury, and yet her funeral was attended by kings and queens. Her body, frail and light even in life, rested inside a glass-topped casket made of simple wood lined with white silk. She wore her trademark white habit with blue trim. A wooden rosary lay across her folded hands. No makeup, no embellishment, just as she had lived. Humble, direct, without ornament. Her face was thin, her skin sallow from age and illness. Yet to those who approached her casket there was still something radiant. Her wrinkles seemed like scars from a life of service. Her eyes, though closed, carried memory. Pope John Paul II sent a message of mourning. Bill Clinton called her a saint among us. But it was the poor, those she fed, clothed, touched, who grieved most deeply. The open casket sat on a bed of rose petals. Mourners passed silently. Some kissed the glass, others left handwritten prayers. Choirs sang in dozens of languages. The air was heavy with incense and tears. The state funeral was held at the same stadium where she had once tended to the sick and dying. But the open casket vigil was the soul of it all. For many, it wasn't just about seeing her, it was about feeling her presence one final time. Even in death, Mother Teresa drew crowds not through grandeur, but through gravity, a small woman in stature, enormous in spirit. The open casket was not a spectacle, it was a last mission to comfort those she left behind by reminding them, even saints are human. 15th, Abraham Lincoln, April 15, 1865. Washington, D.C., the Civil War had just ended. The nation was beginning to breathe again until a bullet pierced through Ford's theater and history itself. President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated, and what followed was one of the most monumental and haunting funeral displays ever recorded, a 1,700-mile open-casket train tour across the grieving Union. Lincoln's body, embalmed in haste, was first displayed in the East Room of the White House. He lay in a black suit, gloved hands folded over his chest. His signature beard remained intact, though his features had to be reinforced with cosmetics and wax. The bullet had shattered his skull behind the left ear. It took time, skill, and science to prepare him for what would come next. Over the next 2 weeks, Lincoln's open casket was viewed by more than 1.5 million people in 11 cities. From Baltimore to New York, Chicago to Springfield, Americans filed past his glass-topped coffin in stunned silence. It was the first time many had seen a president up close, and certainly the first time they'd seen one so still. What shocked people most wasn't the wounds, it was the transformation. Lincoln's body, exposed to constant movement and temperature shifts, began to decay visibly by the time it reached Ohio. His face darkened, his lips receded. Some mourners said he didn't even look like himself anymore, but they still came, by the thousands, because it wasn't just Lincoln they were mourning, it was unity, hope, the future that had been stolen. Black Americans wept openly at his side, freedmen placed wreaths, Union soldiers saluted through tears. His son Tad kissed his cheek before the casket closed for good in Springfield. The journey was long, the images eternal. The open casket of Abraham Lincoln wasn't just a final viewing, it was a nation's baptism of grief, a rolling requiem that stitched together a country torn apart. And even today, more than 150 years later, we still see him, not just on currency or monuments, but in that final haunting display of vulnerability and sacrifice. A man whose eyes had seen too much, now closed forever. In the stillness of death, these icons gave us one last gift, the truth. Behind the fame, the legacy, the spotlight, they were human, fragile, mortal, but through these open casket farewells, we were allowed to say goodbye, not to the myth, but to the person beneath it, and that is unforgettable.